Hello, and thanks for joining us today. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for our webinar on state and local government effective reporting through XBRL financial data standards. We're very happy to have everybody with us today, and I want to go through a few logistical points before I introduce our speakers and the agenda. We are offering CPE credit for the session today. And if you're getting CPE credit, just make sure that you respond to the poll questions that are asked at 2 different points during the session today. And we need to record your responses, and then we'll get your certificate out to you. Secondly, if you have any kind of technical issues through the session, please email us at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at xbrl.us. And we will do our best to get you back up and online. And finally, I wanted to point out that we are taking questions as we go through the session, and you'll see a Q&A button at the top of your screen. And if you click on that, you can send us a question, and we'll take it as they come in. Everyone who is not presenting is on mute today, except for our speakers, of course. And so that's the best way to send your questions in. So with that, I'm going to go to our topics and speakers. We're going to start off with a presentation or a few words from Kenny Pointer. Kenny is a CPA and Executive Director at the National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers. And we're very happy to have Kenny with us today, and also very pleased that, that NASAC has jointly sponsored this program with us. So we're very happy to have you all join us. Our second speaker, who's going to be covering data standards in a municipal marketplace, is Mark Jaffe. Mark is the chair of the XBRL US State and Local Disclosure Modernization Working Group, and he is also a senior policy analyst at the Reason Foundation. Our next speaker will be Shannon Soul. Shannon is a CPA and a PhD. She's Senior Research Associate at NIU's Center for Governmental Studies. Shannon is going to be talking a little bit about who benefits from data standards in state and government reporting. Next, we'll have a couple of CPE questions that I'll be addressing. And then Shannon's going to take over again and lead us in a discussion with John Reedhead. John is a CPA and Director of the State of Utah Division of Finance, and also with Peter Austin, who is a county administrator at McHenry County of Illinois. So we're really looking forward to that discussion to hear directly from some of the municipalities as to how standards might affect them. Then Mark is going to take over again and talk a little bit about the plan for data standards. And then Kenny is going to wrap up with what's next and what's ahead. And then finally, we'll be taking a couple of additional CPE questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kenny, who's going to give us a few of his thoughts on NASAC and data standards. Kenny?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that kind introduction. And before we get started, I just want to thank you for your hard work in setting up today's webinar, and also all of your work in supporting the State and Local Government Disclosure Modernization Working Group. And congratulations to you and the other members of the working group on its release of the draft CAFR taxonomy, which was released just last Thursday, January 17th. And welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're joined by about 160 or so interested individuals across the United States. So obviously this is a topic of high interest. NASAC is an observer of the working group along with the U.S. Census Bureau and a number of other organizations. And NASAC's interest in XBRL really lies in its potential to make financial statements easier to analyze and to allow for comparisons of information across various governments. You know, given today's technology and all the advancements, it seems that users should be able to compare financial information from various governments without having to scan PDF files and or perhaps enter data manually into spreadsheets, which I think is what most people have to do today. NASAC has been interested in XBRL and its application in government for many, many years. In fact, in 2003, NASAC joined XBRL US as a regular member. Our goal then was to learn how technology could be applied, or how this technology could be applied to governments, a goal that we still share today. In 2003, most of the attention was focused on the private sector reporting, which ultimately led to the SEC's adoption of XBRL for corporate financial reporting in 2008. Also in 2008, NASAC worked along with our colleagues at the Association of Government Accountants, or AGA, on a project to develop an XBRL taxonomy for government-wide financial statements. We worked with the state of Oregon and then State Controller John Radford. The taxonomy was successful. It was developed successfully, but to my knowledge was never published. So you go from 2008, fast forward all the way to 2018 in the present, when XBRL and the interest in XBRL technology for government reporting is on the rise again. This interest has been driven in part by Florida House Bill 1073, which examines XBRL reporting for Florida local governments. NASAC is pleased to participate in today's webinar as we all attempt, all of us today, including NASAC members and others, we attempt to learn more about XBRL and how it can potentially assist in making government financial reporting more effective. Let's use the next hour to learn about this technology from members of the working group and from various representatives from state and local governments. So with that, with those introductory remarks, let me turn it over now to Mark Jaffe. Mark?
Thanks, Kenny. Just sharing my screen. I want to make sure everyone can see that. So I am a consumer of CAFRs, and I start by saying you've worked really hard on your CAFRs. Now, I don't know that from the point of view of producing a CAFR. I haven't produced them, but reading them and seeing the many pages of footnotes, management discussion and analysis, all the calculations that have to go into producing the numbers, I realize that it's quite an endeavor. I've also noticed from my outreach to various folks in the auditing and accounting world that we have something called CAFR season, which generally goes from July to December. Now, I'm old enough to remember Wabbit season from Bugs Bunny cartoons, so this is a bit of a revelation for me. But it just illustrates to me that people are really heads down, doing the calculations and doing the preparation necessary to release these very important documents. So you do all this work and you want an audience for what you've done. But when we look at the world of information consumers, we find that corporate disclosure is just much more widely available and much more easily accessible than the data that you all work so hard to put together. And as Kenny pointed out, a big driver of that is the fact that the Securities and Exchange Commission adopted extensible business reporting language, XBRL, for corporate financial disclosures about a decade ago. What we're seeking through this call and the other activities of the working group is to begin to bring state and local government up to the same standard of reporting that companies have. So if we look here at this example, the top is an inline XBRL filing that's available on the Securities and Exchange Commission's website. Now, 99% of you and 99% of investors have probably never seen this. But because the document is available in a machine readable format, it can be loaded and reorganized and represented in many, many different ways by information providers. So you can see in the bottom pane here, I just selected Yahoo Finance. I could have selected MarketWatch, Bloomberg, or Google Finance, or many other financial reporting websites that are available for free or at low cost on the web, and been able to show similar information. So the fact that these providers are able to access the SEC's website and get the data in machine readable form makes it inexpensive for them to repackage the data for the public to use. So that's what we'd like to see with municipal finance. Hey Google, what's the state of Utah's net position?
In 2018, Utah's primary government net position was $2.5 billion.
Now, this couldn't happen today. When I asked the real Google Assistant this question, she said something like, I can't help with that. Unfortunately, Alexa was no more informative. But once we get government financial information into this type of format, machine readable format, this kind of interaction will be possible, and it'll be much easier for the public, municipal bond investors, and other stakeholders to be able to see see and work with this kind of information. So now I'm going to take you through what we've released. So this page from XBRL US's website, XBRL US, XBRL Taxonomy 2019 CAFR, has links to the taxonomy itself and 15 example documents. So these are 15 CAFR extracts for the years 2017 or 2018 that have been converted into XBRL format and then displayed through a viewer that was created by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So let's look at one of those, which is Alexandria, Virginia's CAFR. So again, this is just a few pages of the CAFR. You will see, though, that some of the links actually display the full CAFR. We've only tagged about 100 elements so far. This is a preliminary demonstration taxonomy, but the idea is that we will do subsequent releases where much more of the document will be tagged. And so what do I mean by tagging? What I mean is that a particular financial statement item becomes associated with a string that tells a computer or a human reader more about what that means. So let's, for example, look at governmental activities, cash and cash equivalents. In this SEC viewer, if I click on it, I can see metadata, certain additional details about this particular financial statement item. So I can see, for example, that it's associated with government activities and primary government, and that it's associated with the accrual basis of accounting. As all you know, the government-wide statements are accrual-based, while the fund statements are modified accrual. But then if I move over a little, I can also get a definition. And this is a definition that roughly approximates what's on the GARS, Government Accounting Research Service website provided by GASB. We got a lot of the definitions by referring to that source, as well as other authoritative sources of public accounting information. Here you can see exactly where in the codification that information came from. So it came from, in this case, section 2, paragraph 2450. So that gives you an idea of where that information comes from. If I scroll through more of the CAFR, we've got the statement of net position. We've tagged a few items from the statement of activities, and then some fund balance information that we've tagged as well. So here you can see the breakup of general fund balances and government-wide, total governmental fund balances. So again, clicking on, say, for example, assigned, I can see that this is the assigned fund balance. I can see the value, and I can scroll over and see what it means. So this is much more user-friendly way of accessing the data for casual use, but that's ultimately just part of the story. What we ultimately want is a much more easy way to work with the data in bulk. So if I move over to this Excel spreadsheet, first let's start with what happens if you work with Alexandria, Virginia's current financial statement, which is in PDF form. So if I were to copy and paste this whole page, the statement of net position, I would get something like this, which is really not useful. Now, for some of the more technically sophisticated members of the audience today, you'll know that there are advanced PDF conversion utilities that can do a better job of this. But why should that be necessary? Shouldn't you just be able to work with the document in its raw form? So if I had just taken that Alexandria financial statement that I was showing you a moment ago, just to bring that back up for as a reminder, I could have copied and pasted this and gotten in Excel this much more attractive, much more usable result. And all I did before the call is that I did the copy and paste, and then I did adjust the column and column lists and row heights. But other than that, I did nothing to the document. So it just becomes just much easier to work with. Now, this deals with only a single financial statement. What if you want to work with a large number of financial statements? So we've developed some open source software in a programming language called Python, which can read through the financial statements that we posted and display the data. So here, for example, you're seeing the breakdown of general fund balance, non-spendable, committed, assigned, unassigned. We'll have restricted in the next release. And then I also took down the general fund balance and the total balance, the revenues, and the expenditures. Then within the Python script itself, we inserted a calculation into the Excel workbook. So we could automatically calculate a pretty important ratio that many government finance analysts look at, which is the ratio of the general fund balance to general fund expenditures. And so we can see in the case of Alexandria, they have a pretty healthy balance of 21%. So the software to do that is open sourced, and it's available from the Reason Foundation's GitHub repository. And the project is called Parse CAFR IXBRL. You can view that at your leisure, or contact me if you have questions about how the software was developed and how it can be improved. So returning to our main page for the XBRL taxonomy, we've looked at one of the instance documents. You can click on any of these others and look at them as well. But we also wanted to call your attention to this, which is the taxonomy itself. So we have, for example, the labels of the items that we included in the taxonomy, assigned fund balance being one example of that. And then here you can see under documentation what the definition was. And you might remember that popped up in that SEC viewer that I showed later. And then further over to the right, there are references to the authoritative literature, in this case, the GARS codification, where we show where we got this definition from. So what we're hoping that some of you on the call will do is go to this website, look at this document, and tell us what can be improved. And as we'll discuss later, we will make this available to you in a bit more of a digestible form. There is some techno geek kind of stuff in here, and what we want to do is sort of present you the key columns that we think you would be most comfortable commenting on. So with that, Michelle, I can turn it over to Shannon.
Great, thanks, Mark. And if you can unshare your screen, and what I'm going to do is go back to my slides. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Shannon.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. You've had a chance to hear and even see a glimpse of what it might look like to unleash data from PDFs in Mark's demonstration. The research and the experience of the private sector, as well as foreign governments, that's what really drove us to help states and local governments capture some of the same benefits of XBRL, that is, applying this technology to automate the process of creating, collecting, and analyzing data. So let's take a look at some of the key benefits that can be achieved. First, data analysis becomes more efficient, affordable, and meaningful through higher quality and more granular comparisons. As we know, the current level of discretion allowed in financial reporting, combined with the manual processes needed to compile the data, render comparisons that can be risky or even ineffective for decision making. A taxonomy would help increase the reliability of what each concept means and how it's represented when extracted. In my line of work, I continue to see local governments that are still comparing themselves to other local governments based on simplistic measures like, let's say, proximity or size of or population, and even some that focus heavily on certain funds like the general fund. But with XBRL, one could easily incorporate multiple variables to compare data. Also, simply aggregating one type of variable with another for comparative purposes doesn't always work. As Mark demonstrated, there's different ways to slice and dice the data that to qualify the data. You may need to know if one figure is accrual-based while the other is reported in some other basis of accounting, whether the amount stems from governmental activities or business-type activities, or if it pertains to, let's say, the primary government or component unit, and so on. So you kind of get the point that XBRL can help consumers clarify and qualify the data before they even begin to work with it. Modern disclosure reporting also allows us to implement or even improve fiscal distress assessments. As some of us have seen in the video, All the Queen's Horses, that's the largest case of local government embezzlement that took place in Dixon, Illinois, to the tune of about $53 million. Digitizing CAFRs better equips states to prevent future similar cases, or at least detect cases early on and help mitigate losses. Generating trend forecast and other specialized data models would also be more feasible. This past year, our university assisted our Lieutenant Governor's office by developing a tool we call the Local Government Efficiency Assessment Program Tool. We call it actually LEAP, L-E-A-P for short, if that's a mouthful. If you know anything about Illinois, we have 8,500 plus taxing bodies, so we're always looking for ways to research those many layers of government. This LEAP data modeling tool helps us assess different what-if scenarios in terms of what would happen if we had different structural arrangements like consolidation, shared services, partnerships, and so on. But our tool requires extensive manual procedures, as you may have guessed, which is why digital CAFRs would be a game changer for researchers and ultimately taxpayers. Reducing ambiguity of data could strengthen activities such as negotiations. Here's an example. Recently, the LA Times covered the threat of the teacher strike in the LA Unified School District. The union reports a $2 billion surplus, while the superintendent countered that the deficit was nearly $20 billion. And I think some of you have seen this before, where they're pulling from the same document, and they're pulling from, let's say, the same year, and they're calling it something similar, and they're both correct, but they're pulling from different positions or reports, statements within the CAFR. So in this case, if you have followed along, the $20 billion deficit reported by the superintendent accounts for long-term liabilities such as pensions and OPEB, while the union's figure does not include the long-term obligations, which could have been highlighted if they were using a taxonomy to extract some of this information. So guidance in working with and interpreting the data is a very important benefit of XBRL. This gives parties more time to talk about the solutions rather than disputing facts about different criteria. Next slide. Better data means more informed decision-making for allocation of resources and financing government, as well as policy formulation. Administrators could more efficiently and economically forecast outcomes of strategies and more feasibly conduct empirical assessments of program funding scenarios, such as determining whether to draw down reserves as opposed to increasing taxes or some other financing option. Also, state and local leaders would be better equipped to sustain their positive outcomes by adopting policies and procedures informed by financial information, such as using in-depth data models to set minimum reserve requirements or debt limits. Next slide. Reducing the cost of compliance and the reporting lag can be achieved by streamlining the reporting process and reducing redundancies, because information becomes reusable. Digitized data can be reused for CAFR prep, such as aggregating the statements of component units, single audits, and TIF reports. Tagged CAFR data can then be repurposed for reports such as popular annual financial reports, EMA reporting, and census of government data. Digital CAFRs can also be presented in lieu of redundant reports, such as states annual financial reports, which sometimes those don't even align with CAFR, especially when new GASB standards aren't incorporated in the AFRs on a timely basis. In Illinois, we still do not have the statement of activities data within our AFR, so that's one of our recommendations we just submitted to our comptroller's office. Also, I was part of a team of researchers where we empirically estimated 23 days shaved off the reporting process in Illinois if CAFR preparers were to submit a digital audit report in lieu of an AFR. Again, the reporting lag is a pretty important benefit to consumers. I should say reducing the reporting lag. Next slide. Here's a big one. Improved analytical capacity and fiscal management practices have the potential to lower costs of borrowing. So here's a related quote from a recent report issued by the Data Foundation and Workiva that sums up this benefit. Having access to the data on a timelier basis will enable data users to do a more thorough assessment of credit risk, thereby enabling the market to divide the government entities that are good credit risks from the poor ones. This will have the knock-on effects of lowering the interest rates paid by governments who present good credit risks and motivating the riskier governments to improve, because improvement pays off with better interest rates. And as we know, the lowering costs of borrowing means more money dedicated directly to programs and services. Next slide. And finally, a more transparent government. Adapting modern disclosure tools stands to increase consumer confidence, which ultimately encourages people to become more engaged and actively participating in the democratic process. And at this time, we'll pause for a couple CPE questions.
Shanna, thanks very much. Okay, so for those of you getting CPE, I'm going to bring up our poll questions. And here is the first question. Financial data standards are designed to do which of the following? First response, to change what municipalities are required to report. Second, streamline reporting and reduce redundancies. Or 3, increase the frequency with which CAFRs must be reported. So please click on the button that you think best represents the response to this question. And we'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Okay, about another 15 seconds. All right, I'm going to shut down the poll and we'll go to our second question. And the question is, which of the following statements about standardized data in municipal reporting is not true? Response number 1, making data available on a more timely basis will enable more thorough analysis of credit risk. Response number 2, standards will make it easier for investors and other users of muni data to understand the meaning of reported data. Or 3, financial data standards will result in more data being reported by municipalities. And remember, the answer is which one is not true, not accurate. So about another 20 seconds here. Okay, we're going to close our poll in about 5 seconds. Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon now, who's going to continue.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Joining us today are 2 governmental practitioners. Again, John Reedhead, Director of Utah's Finance Division, and Peter Austin, the County Administrator of McHenry County, Illinois. They're joining us to discuss how this topic piqued their interest and what value they see in the continued development of an XBRL-based taxonomy for government. At this time, I'd like for the 2 of you to please start by telling us why you're interested in the work on standards, and what kind of efficiencies you think this will bring for your entity. Let's start with you, John. You might be on mute.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that. Yeah, I needed to unmute, but I became interested in 2018, obviously very interested in what Florida led out with in their legislation, and hearing more from our CAFR software vendor, Workiva, and our state treasurer became interested after Florida. He got some calls to him after the Florida announcement about Florida. We became very interested in it for all the benefits that you and Mark and Kenny have explained. I'm very excited about it. I think we do need to provide better access, more transparency to our financial statements. I think doing XBRL will be a big boost to the power users of financial statements. We put a lot of efforts into making transparency of transactions on websites available to the public and to power users, and I don't see why we can't do that for our financial statements. So I'm excited about the uses and hope it continues forward. Did you want me to answer the second one, or do you want me to go to Peter?
Well, let's give Peter.
I'll take the floor. I too want to thank Michelle and Shannon for inviting me to participate in this discussion, because through the process I've learned a lot. I was not very familiar with XBRL prior to the invitation to be in on this, and I look at this really from a manager's perspective. I have spent a career being a local government manager. I'm currently the immediate past president of the National Association of County Administrators, and in my role with the National Association of County Administrators, I've had a seat on a performance management advisory council that ICMA, the International City County Management Association, has been a part of, and we've searched for tools to help measure county performance. Or it's been a challenge because we got 50 states with 50 different models of county government. And it's hard enough to compare county within the state, but when you go across state lines, it becomes more difficult. So this kind of a tool that would help kind of standardize reporting, I think, has a lot of excitement. And I think people are, I'm looking forward to it growing and becoming more available. And I think it's a tool that local government managers can really use to help, make their teams measure against like organizations around the country. Even though there may be different revenue streams and different responsibilities, we can still kind of use the standardized information. And so I think that's going to be good. We all have finite resources. Sometimes those resources are even tighter because of self-imposed restrictions on using revenues. My own local government has kind of challenged me to reduce our property tax levy over the last few years. So tools like this that can really help us, understand what's there and how we're comparing to others can be powerful. As we've gone through the iteration of lowering our property tax revenues over the last couple of years, understanding our fund strengths, and I think Shannon, you mentioned this, that understanding the utilization of reserves and helping my policymakers understand the impact of utilization of reserves. That's been important for me as we've taken steps to reduce our levy. So that all fits under that umbrella of transparency. I thought your points earlier were all spot on about what this can do to give confidence to lenders and to residents and to the policymakers that we're asking to ultimately make decisions. So that's great.
Thanks. That's a great background, Peter, and really good insights too, John. I appreciate that. Now, if you could please tell us what are the biggest challenges of implementing standards, for example, new GASB standards, and what pain points do you anticipate this helping you resolve? We'll start with you, John. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Shannon. I think just the standard things that anytime implementing new standards, it depends on the standard a lot. Some are easy, some are hard, but just having the resources, the time, the staff to study the standard and implement it in the cooperation that we often need from other parties that we have to get additional information from can make it very challenging depending on what the standard is. And as far as pain points, as some of these, as software, like you mentioned, possibly helping us with CAFR preparation if we're trying to consolidate information from different sources, or several different agencies or component units or whatever, and pulling those together. XBRL or a similar tool could help us do that. So not sure quite yet how XBR can help, but I would be excited to have the tool available to give it a try. I think we'll find a lot of uses for it.
I'll echo some of John's comments there. As I sat with my finance staff and talked about, some of the pain points that we might experience in some of the challenges in implementing some of these things. And we did the question quickly moved to those component units of government. And as we mentioned earlier, Illinois has so many thousands of governments within it, but no matter the state, there's a lot of local governments, and we have these component pieces of our county government that I think would need to be addressed, and how ultimately the standards are developed for how we deal with those is a question that we think need to be answered, and maybe work with GASB on that. And another area I think this could be positive and help us is in comparing governments that don't even do CAFRs. In Illinois, we have a lot of governments, local and county governments that don't do CAFRs. They maybe just do a financial statement. So, if we could get them to put in, if this kind of a product could be put in place, that would help us with trend analysis from our peer governments around the state, and maybe being able to sort by budget size and population more easily. That would be something we'd be excited, but that would be a problem that we think this would help us alleviate.
Yeah, that's a good point. For those that are not preparing CAFRs, this will free up state resources to provide more technical assistance in that area. Good point. Finally, I'd like to ask both of you what you foresee as the challenges in getting this implemented internally. And this time, let's start with Peter.
I know that this has a background in as I've learned in the private sector, and it's easy to say, government should run like a business. That's a common statement, and I see the attractiveness to this. Everyone loves to say that government should run like a business. All elected officials I worked for over the years run on running government like a business, and again, that makes a lot of sense a lot of times, but some things can't run like a business very easily, and there are things that you can't make money on, and that's why they're in government. That there is no private sector option. So that's an area where to get acceptance amongst staff and policymakers, I think we'd have to get over that a little bit. Just saying that this is the way business does it doesn't always make sense. So that was a little bit of pushback I got from my staff as we talked about this.
Thank you.
Okay, and from my staff in Utah, I think, getting it done internally, I think, support from stakeholders, why are we working on this, spending time on this? And I think a lot of the advantages and the possibilities that have been mentioned today will help us with the support from our stakeholders. I don't know if we're going to need funding or not, but certainly that is always a concern, but I don't know yet what it's going to take quite to do this. I think we will be looking for software or tool to help us out with this. And like I mentioned before, we are a Workiva customer right now, but and in talking with them, they have us built for their public company clients, and apparently it's not that hard to do. So at first, when you see this, it's pretty complicated, but if we've got the right tools, I think we'll be able to handle it just fine. And I think we definitely need, accessible and clear guidance from XBRL on what the standards are, so we can implement them appropriately. And then we'll just need to identify our internal staff resources that can have the time and the talent to make it happen.
Yeah, John, if I could echo some of that, that was, what is the commitment from staff going to be? That was some of the questions I was getting in. Is this going to run simultaneous with CAFR development, or is it always follow the CAFR? Those were some of the questions that we were kind of kicking around.
Right. In some ways, it's just basically doing things differently. So in the case of the example that we used for a CAFR, digital CAFR being presented in lieu of an AFR, it's redirecting resources to work on a digital CAFR instead of working towards populating an AFR. So, but getting that message across, I believe, John, you mentioned that, or Peter, it might have been you, about just really educating the stakeholders on what this means to them. So I really appreciate both of you sharing your perspectives on this topic today. And at this time, we need to hand it over to Mark to let us know what's in store for the future development of the taxonomy.
Great. Thanks, Shannon, John, and Peter. So before we get into the future, let's just review the past a little. XBRL goes all the way back to 1998, so just over 20 years ago. The AICPA worked with a couple of certified public accountants to develop the first taxonomy for US GAAP corporate reporting. And it was rolled out in many countries and many sectors, including the US FDIC in the early 2000s. In 2006, Spain became the first country to adopt XBRL for local government reporting. There are over 8,000 municipal governments in Spain that now use XBRL to report to the central government. And they report not only annual financial statistics, but budgets and quarterly reports as well. Here in the United States, we're really only seeking to apply this to the annual financial report, be it a CAFR or ultimately a budget-based document as well. So in 2008, as you've heard, the SEC adopted the mandate for corporate financial reporting. Any publicly listed company was ultimately required to produce an XBRL document. More recently, this year, or actually last year, the SEC has begun a further migration to inline XBRL. Those are HTML pages with XBRL tags, like the ones I showed you earlier. So we're recommending skipping over the traditional XBRL filing, going right to the inline XBRL, which shows, which allows you to view the statement in a human readable way on the web, and at the same time parse it into a computer program. Also, as Kenny mentioned, NASDAQ supported the XBRL pilot in Oregon. There was a very interesting report that came out after that. But I think perhaps because of the Great Recession, it became hard for other states and local governments to follow, given the fact that there was just a lot of firefighting being done with budget struggles. Also in 2008, the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board introduced the EMA system, which has really become a great central repository for CAFRs, at least for those governments that issue municipal bonds. But unfortunately, all of that documentation remains in PDF format. So hopefully this renaissance of interest in XBRL will lead to new and more accessible reporting on EMA. So the most recent push started really in 2016 when professors Neil Snow and Jackie Reck produced the first taxonomy, which appeared in a peer-reviewed accounting journal. And then later that year, Shannon and I worked together to present an XBRL prototype at a conference in Washington, D.C. Last year, we had the passage of Florida HB 1073, which funds the development of a taxonomy. And ultimately, if the CFO and other stakeholders in Florida approve, would require its use as a replacement for the state's annual financial report. So ultimately, we hope that Florida jurisdictions will be able to consolidate their financial reporting into one document, an inline XBRL CAFR, as opposed to what they're doing now, which is producing an Excel file for the state and then a PDF for the federal government and the municipal bond market. We also developed a prototype CAFR for the city of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg has been a real leader in this area, along with the startup company Intrinio, which is based in St. Petersburg. So we found, I live in Northern California, which I thought was where all technology came from. And in fact, I've been educated that there are other technology centers around the country, and St. Petersburg is one of those. Our working group formed, and then later in 2018, a grant modernization process or grant modernization bill passed in the House, did not make it through the Senate, but it'll be reproposed this year or certainly by next year. And what that act would have done is turned all of the single audit, formerly known as A133 procedure information from PDF to machine readable formats. That would have been one of the consequences of the GREAT Act. And we hope that Congress looks at that again next year. Michelle, next slide. All right, so in terms of the working group rollout, we've had our first in-person meeting in St. Petersburg last August. And now we've moved forward and released the first prototype. So this focuses primarily on the statement of net position, but we did sprinkle in a few items from the statement of activities and 2 of the governmental fund financial statements. We're planning later in 2019 to do 2 further releases, one in April and one in July. Right now, we've kicked off a 60-day comment period to get your feedback on this first demonstration release, and we will have similar feedback periods after the next 2 releases. Okay, Michelle, so we can go on to the next slide in terms of the call for action. So really appreciate everyone taking the time today to listen to us. We do hope you'll not only come away with this enthusiastic about the possibilities of how technology can improve government financial reporting and make it more accessible to bondholders, citizens, and other stakeholders, but we also hope that you'll be excited enough to actually work with us on this project. So here are some things that I hope at least some of you listening today will consider doing. One is joining the working group. We have a number of public sector representatives observing the working group and participating in our calls and subcommittees. We can always use more, and we welcome your participation. If you've liked what you've seen for Alexandria and some of the other cities that we've shown today, consider doing a pilot for your city, county, state, or special district. Please reach out to Michelle, Shannon, or me, and we can explain how that could potentially work. You've heard today something about Workiva. There were actually 5 software vendors that participated in the pilot. So you can see the names of those software vendors on that prototype webpage that I showed you a little earlier. So if you work with one of those vendors already, it should be pretty easy for you to do a pilot. If, however, you're working with another software vendor that does not currently support inline XBRL, we urge you to urge them to do so and ask them to join our working group and participate as well. Of course, many folks do not use bespoke software for the preparation of CAFRs. You may be using some combination of Excel or Word. There are ways of getting those to live with inline XBRL, but we certainly welcome your calls, and we can give you advice on either how to get legacy software to work with this, or make suggestions to you about contacting an appropriate software vendor. Once you've produced an inline XBRL format, you want the world to see it. One thing that any government listening to this phone call can do is post that document on their website. But have even more folks be able to see and engage with these interactive documents, we would encourage you to contact regulators and oversight bodies that may be responsible for posting or disseminating your CAFR, and asking them whether they would accept an inline XBRL filing, and if so, whether they would post it. If they're not comfortable, find out what it might be preventing them from using it, and tell us, so we can improve what we're doing here so that it becomes more comfortable to the wider oversight community. And then in your individual states, consider state-specific taxonomy laws like the one that passed in Florida, and coming up with ways of encouraging more local governments statewide to participate, so that we can do the kinds of intergovernment comparisons that we were talking about a little earlier on the call. So with that, Michelle, I can turn it back to you.
Mark, thanks very much. And I'm actually going to turn it over to Kenny, who's going to talk a little bit about what's next for NASAC.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I'm just going to build a little bit on what Mark just outlined, the call to action. But just from my perspective, and I think NASAC's perspective in general, I would suggest two things in terms of what's next. One, we would like our NASAC members, many of them are on the phone today, to respond to the draft taxonomy, and certainly would encourage everybody on the phone to respond to that draft taxonomy. Secondly, I think just encourage everybody to start thinking about the possibilities. Let me say a few things about the draft taxonomy. Michelle just put up a screenshot here of a revised taxonomy, and the reason it's revised is the columns to the left are the ones that are most relevant to NASAC members and to preparers, auditors, and treasurers. So as I think Mark mentioned early on, the taxonomy has a lot of different columns, some of which are really specific to the technical aspects of XBRL. Michelle's realigned this spreadsheet so that you can easily, auditors, controllers, treasurers, pick out those columns that are most relevant and what we're going to be asking you to respond to. So the taxonomy has a 60-day comment period that puts us at or around March 2021 for everyone's comments. NASAC members, you can expect an email from me no later than the end of this week with some instructions on how to respond. You'll have a link to this Excel spreadsheet that you see on the screen now, and we'll develop a plan for providing responses and feedback back to US or XBRL US. So that's number one. Secondly, I would just suggest to everybody listening in today, based on what you've heard from the presenters, begin to imagine the potential uses of XBRL in your respective jurisdictions, whether you be state or local government. I know we have a number of state auditors participating today, many of whom have responsibility for collecting financial information of local governments. And based on your specific requirements, would something like XBRL make your processes in gathering and analyzing local government financial information more effective? And, I just think back, I think John mentioned it, the transparency websites. Most every government has those now, and it's hard to predict where we might be 5 years from now using XBRL or some other technology to better report our financial operations more effectively. But think back to the time when governments first started their transparency websites and how these websites have enhanced transparency over the years. Transparency websites are vastly improved from where they were when they first started. Where will we be 5 years from now in providing more effective financial reporting through XBRL. I just ask you to start thinking about that and start envisioning those possibilities. And hopefully today's webinar has helped in that regard. Michelle, I'll turn it back to you.
Kenny, thanks very much. We have a couple of more CPE questions, and then we actually have a question from the audience that I'd like to address. But first, let me go through the CPE questions because I want to make sure everyone gets this. So I'm going to open up our polls. We have 2 remaining CPE questions. And you should be able to see this on your screen now. The XBRL standard was first developed in which year? In 1998, in 2010, or in 2005? So just take a couple seconds here and respond to this question. Just like another 30 seconds here. So which year was the XBRL standard first developed? 1998, 2010, or 2005? Okay, just another 10 seconds. All right, I'm going to close down this poll and we'll bring up our final poll. XBRL is used for reporting in the United States by which of the following? By banks, public companies, credit rating agencies, and mutual funds, by all financial institutions, or by banks and insurance companies? So again, just click on the button that represents the appropriate answer. Just like another 30 seconds here. And typically we get the CPE certificates out within the next week or 2. And while we're waiting to complete this, I did get a question from someone about accessing the slides. And we can make the slides available tomorrow. We will also be sending out a link to the replay for the event itself. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and shut down this poll, and then we'll go to questions. Another question came in, will this presentation be available on YouTube? Yes, it actually was live streamed, and it'll be posted there. And that'll be the link that we'll be sending out to everybody. The question I received for the audience here, from the audience rather, is do you anticipate that XBRL will be optional for governments to adopt or mandatory? For example, through MSRB rulemaking. And I don't know if Mark or Shannon, you'd like to address that question?
So this is Mark. We submitted some comments to MSRB last year, and our suggestion was that the MSRB implement the SEC's viewer and allow and facilitate voluntary filings. So we think really at this stage of the game, we're at a point where we like this technology to be shaken out. We need early adopters. And I think in general, it's premature to talk about mandates. I would say that ultimately, so when we get to the year 2100, I don't envision a world where people will be filing in PDFs, and there will have to be something different that everyone uses. But sometime between now and 2100, we don't need to be talking about mandates quite yet.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. Another question we received, looking back at one ongoing controversy, a feature to some, a flaw to others, the SEC's XBRL rules permitted filers to create extensions in order to reflect unusual or unique aspects of their business. And just for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, extension means creating a new concept that doesn't exist in the taxonomy that reflects a very unique reporting situation. And so that term, that concept that's created is then inconsistent with what other people or what other organizations are reporting. So the question is, how important will extensibility be? What do you think the effects will be on comparability between like governmental entities?
I can take that also,
Sure.
Michelle. The working group adopted a resolution at its first meeting, which discouraged the use of extensions. We've also reviewed financial oversight methodologies from multiple states and private organizations. And we've identified several dozen financial statement items that people use during evaluations. And I would say that the working group is committed to making sure that those are provided in a standardized way. And then beyond that, we'll have to see. There may be a role for extensions, but we don't want to have extensions to the exclusion of making sure that commonly used and consumed financial concepts are provided in a standardized manner.
Mark, thanks very much. Yes, I think that's all of the questions we have. I wanted to just put this up on the screen. This is the URL to go directly to the public review page for the CAFR taxonomy, the demonstration release. So if you want to note that down, you can go there straight away. But we will be sending out tomorrow an email including a link to the replay of this event and the slides, and also instructions on how to access the materials that are posted. So I want to thank all of our speakers who did an excellent job today outlining the plan and what we're doing. And thanks also to all of our, all of the people who registered and attended the event today. And we hope you'll check out the taxonomy. Thanks very much.